right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm Alex Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of Transportation Choices Coalition. I use she, her pronouns. And you are at a transit talk that Transportation Choices Coalition is hosting around the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, public transit and mobility across this country. I'll start by talking a little bit about TCC, then our panelists will introduce themselves. We'll go into a moderated discussion and then open up for questions and answers. So TCC is a statewide transportation advocacy and policy organization based in Seattle and working across Washington state in its 26th year of fighting for more and better transportation options for all Washingtonians. We work to change the rules and ensure that there are adequate resources and full-throated support for a world of affordable, walkable, bikeable communities that are connected by great transit. Transportation Choices Coalition would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we're gathering today virtually, our panel is joining from the unceded lands across the U.S. nation. We're calling in from the tribal land of the Coast Salish people, the tribal land of the Tongva people, specifically the Hahamongna, and the tribal land of the Piscataway peoples. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom, like the Duwamish, are still fighting for federal recognition. Mobility for all cannot be achieved without recognizing and honoring those that first navigated these spaces. And as we all work to build a more accessible world, let's be mindful that we do so on stolen land. Today, we honor with gratitude the physical spaces in which we occupy and the communities past, present, and future who live and thrive here. So before we get started, I just want to point out a few things about how our webinar is going to work in our virtual space. You'll notice that we've disabled the chat feature to make it a bit easier for us to manage receiving your questions, which we definitely want to get and respond to. So if you have questions, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and staff from TCC will be sorting through them and bringing them to me, and then I'll bring them to our excellent panel. The whole talk is going to be recorded, and a link is going to be emailed to you once it's available to download. You should be able to change your view settings to your personal preference, which is in the top right-hand side of your screen. However, we're going to default to the host view. So this is TCC's first webinar, and despite living in the Zoom age, we ask for your grace as we navigate technology. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. We're going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Alex Brennan.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Brennan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the executive director of Futurewise, which is Washington State's land use policy advocacy organization.
Dennis Antonellis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dennis Antonellis. I am an international representative for the Amalgamated Transit Union, and I represent approximately 8,000 transit workers in the state of Washington.
Thank you, Dennis. Emiko Atherton.
Hi, my name is Emiko Atherton. I'm Vice President of Thriving Communities at Smart Growth America in Washington, D.C. I'm also I am the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a program of Smart Growth America. I am also a Seattle native, but I want to acknowledge that I am calling in from DC today, and on the land, the Nutchatanktank tribe, which our beautiful Anacostia River was named after. So thank you for having me today. And my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. And Rio Oxas.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rio Oxas. I use they, them. I'm starting an organization called RAO, which is the consultancy at intersections of earth, land rights, and equity and racial justice. I just want to give a gratitude to TCC on that beautiful land acknowledgement and for having this conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to start with an overview of what the coronavirus pandemic has meant for public transportation. So acknowledging that this has upended the entirety of our society and our economy, this has also been nothing short of a catastrophe for public transit. So while also simultaneously reinforcing the essential nature and the deep need for public transportation and mobility to be accessible to all people, and the degree to which the entirety of the economy relies on transit service and the people who use it. So the direct impacts to transit have been a ridership collapse. So as folks are staying home or choosing other modes, here in King County, we've seen a 70% reduction in a service and higher across other modes like sound transit. That has been matched with a revenue decline. So as fare box recovery has in many agencies moved to zero, as agencies have gone fare free or significantly declined, as well as many transit agencies relying on sales tax as their underlying tax base, Transit Center estimates that this could be a $38 billion hit to public transit agencies across the United States, which is why the federal government stabilization fund and recovery money is so critically needed and is really the only entity that can meet the scale of that need. At the same time, transit agencies have had increased costs as it relates to cleaning and materials. Response from agencies has been to increased sanitation. Many agents aboard both the buses and the bases, the cease fare collection and fare enforcement, implementing rear door boarding and a cordon section between the operator and the riders. We're starting to see agencies requiring and suggesting masks for all riders, implementing policies about maximum number of riders who can be aboard a bus or a train, and also significant service reductions, while also needing to keep baseline service up for people who rely on transit, as well as to keep social distancing protocols. Additionally, we've seen capital projects be delayed and ballot measures be deferred for revenue for transit agencies. So while many people are staying home, we know from analysis that the Transit Center has done that 2.8 million Americans rely on transit to get to their what are deemed essential jobs. And here in Washington State, that number is 87,520 people who are grocery store workers, healthcare workers, and other essential workforce who are keeping our society functioning at this time, as well as the fact that people who were reliant on transit to get to goods and resources that their communities couldn't provide through walkable access still rely on transit. And then, of course, our transit workforce. There are 725,000 people who comprise our transit workforce in the United States. 500,000 of those folks are frontline workers coming in direct contact with people every day in the course of their work. And we're seeing higher rates of infection and fatality in transit operators. So I'm going to start with Dennis and ask Dennis, how is the COVID-19 outbreak affecting transit workers?
Well, the effect on transit workers is we are exposed at a greater rate because we are in an enclosed vehicle. Even with the safety precautions of the 6-foot distancing, people are getting on the buses. They don't have masks, whether they weren't able to get them because they were in such short supply. And of course, the healthcare workers got first crack at them. They're now becoming more available for us, but still the public doesn't have it. So I've heard terms like, we're a petri dish, where people are coming on the buses. They are overcrowding the buses. On the buses, they are not practicing the 6-foot distancing, social distancing. And some buses and some bus lines, especially in Seattle, they're having full buses, just like normal service. So we run the risk of being exposed to a much greater degree. The folks that drive the vans for the disabled, it's a much smaller vehicle. It should be limited to one passenger per vehicle because of the size, but it's not in most cases. They put more than one. It's difficult to, once again, have the social distancing. So we are way more exposed to the disease. And a lot of buses, there are no barriers to protect the drivers. So if someone comes on the front door, the exposure rate is much greater. We have lost people who have gone out because they have children that there's no daycare for them, not going to school. They have to be home to take care of their children. Those that may, if they think that they have been exposed, they need to report that to the employer, in which case they have to go home and self-isolate themselves for a period of time. Could be as much as 14 days. Go get tested. We've had, I think, people who have tested positive. I don't remember the exact number. We've lost one driver that passed away due to the virus. But it's not just bus drivers that are at risk. We have mechanics, we have customer service agents, we have the cleaning staff that goes out and tries to clean these buses, and the high touch points is what they're called, as much as possible. It can't be done after every trip at a lot of locations. There's just not enough people to do it. I'm told they do deep cleans every night, but unfortunately, because of the infection rate of the virus, the bus goes out the next day, and who knows what's going to happen. So the effect on the transit workers is tremendous. We hear about the frontline nurses, doctors. I've heard a lot about the grocery store workers, all very essential employees, and we're all subject to that. But we are in a much more confined area than the others. So I believe that's the main thing that we are facing right now.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Let's talk about what's happening right now and the response that we're seeing. So what are we seeing and learning about mobility, public transit, and active transportation from COVID-19? And in the response, what's working and what's not? And I'm going to start with Rio.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Dennis, for lifting that up. And, I think one thing that you also are talking about is grief, right? Like there is grief happening in our communities, and there's grief happening in your community right now, bus drivers. So definitely condolences to all the family members who are going through something that's very real, right? So I think at this moment, that is part of what we're seeing, right, and dealing with. I just wanted to take a pause to acknowledge the grief that we're feeling as a community, right? For all of us to think about that, and how important it is, therefore, for us to really think about how to move in a direction that can help mitigate some of that, right? And so at the moment, some of the things that I thought about a lot was, wow, there's a lot of essential workers who have to get on the bus to go to wherever they need to. The bus drivers have to work, right? They're essential workers. They're required to work, right? So I think on one line, definitely agree with the grocery store workers who unionize to get hazard pay. Super important, and that's something that the federal government should be compensating right at the moment. Instead of bailing out corporations who are non-essential, we need to really start putting in that money to get those masks that Dennis was talking about. Even if it's like, hey, now the bus is loaded with masks, so that anybody who gets on has a mask, right? Like these are very simple things that the government could choose to spend their monies on. So I've been thinking about that, and that's in the short term. And in the long term, I'm thinking about what's been highlighted is the fact that a lot of our essential services are not within walking distance, are not within bike distance, right? Like some communities are deserts when it comes to good food, clinics, jobs, whatever other essential services there's out there, they're deserts, right? And so people are forced to get into trains or buses to reach these resources and their jobs alone. So I think there's a lot to be said around that and thinking about our built environment, right? And what does it mean to bring the essential services to people in that equitable way? And I know there's questions about it coming up later, but the opportunity is now, right? And so I'll pause to say that, but the opportunity is now.
Well, I do agree with you. One point I failed to mention, and most bus drivers, most transit employees, never in their wildest dreams ever thought that they would be considered an essential worker. I don't think anybody's ever really thought that we were going to experience a pandemic to the level that we have. And not giving that kind of thought and not being prepared with all of the personal protection equipment that is necessary. And there is still equipment that has not been provided for just because we were totally unprepared. I think I'm an advocate for when a person gets off work, they should bring a change of clothing. There should be a decontamination area so that we could go in there, we could shower, we could change our clothes and not bring this home to our families, because we don't even think about that. You get off work, you get in your car and you drive home. Now, if you have been in a confined area, there's every possibility that you have it on your clothing. If you're not trained to properly take off your mask and your gloves, and whether or not you wear goggles or a gown or whatever the case may be, if you're not properly trained to remove those articles, you just infected it. You're infected because you just touched the outer garment. We had conversations about putting up some sort of like a shower curtain or some sort of plastic around the driver's compartment in order to give us a little bit more protection. But then the point was raised that, when you move that, you push it back to get out of the seat to go assist with a disabled passenger, you've just contaminated the driver's compartment again. So these are things I don't think anybody's really thought about until recently. So.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that last point you said, Dennis, because I think what we're also seeing is how disenfranchised, and I really borrow this from Darrell Baldwin, who's really been pushing us to not think about vulnerability, but think about institutional forms of everything, right? Racism, classism, all the intersections that have literally put some people like at extremely high risk. So I wanted to pause to say that. But yeah, a lot of the folks in the disability community, I know Darrell Baldwin really does a lot of work around this, has lifted up the ways in which people with disabilities right now, if they're doing backloading, right, they can't even get on there, right? So there's a lot of ways in which what we're seeing at this time is if you do not have the means or money, you're going to be at higher risk for the virus, right? And so it is, and we're seeing this, that literally people who are blue collar workers, Black, African, and African American communities, all of those, and then disability communities and indigenous communities and so forth are getting hit much higher. And a lot of it has to do with not having access to those resources, right? And I think this is what is being highlighted. Like, I think, again, I've always said this, mobility justice is at the intersection of every single social justice movement out there, right? It's how you reach your clinics, your food, your education, your job. Like, we're actually doing a very big job at this time, right? As folks who are literally busing people around, and those of us who are being advocates in thinking about like this space. Now the public space has become really risky to be in, right? So what does that mean for us as advocates who ask people to move, right? Who try to get people to move, and those of us who are working around the built environment, right? Yeah, so just some thoughts that I've been having. So I'm glad you're lifting that up too, about the communities who are just at most risk right now. And it goes both ways, the people who serve them and the people who are the ones who really need it.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. There are certain locations around the country where they are now issuing full face masks, plastic face masks, so that when they have to deal up close with people, I don't want to call out any group, but there is no way you could social distance when you are loading disabled people in wheelchairs or blind people that need help to get on the vehicle and sit down. That social distancing goes out the door. You could be 6 inches away, not 6 feet away. And, unfortunately, they get sick as well. So there's carriers. And some agencies now have recognized that. And there's a push now to get face masks so that they can protect them and nobody is coughing or sneezing or anything on a driver's face. But once again, if you're not trained to take the safety equipment off, you're just infecting yourself. But it should be made available. And I don't think anybody really gave that any thought. Nobody expected this. So thank you for bringing that up.
Another way in which people are moving to meet their needs in this time is the streets and the sidewalks. So how are our public right-of-way, our streets and our sidewalks meeting both transit access or not meeting, and mobility during a time of physical distancing? And what is best practice, or what are cities doing to respond to the need for increased level of physical space for people? Emiko, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. That's a great question. Before answering that, I think we all have to remember that in North America, but specifically in the United States, we do not give enough space for people to move outside of their cars. If you look at, a cross section of the street, we're allocating about 5% of every right of way to people. And so we see this play out right now when we're asking people to physically distance from each other, but they're often still confined to their sidewalks, to bike lanes. So in many cities, we're seeing overcrowding on the sidewalks or on trails. Some cities are taking the proactive response to shut down streets or create slowed streets. We're seeing this in cities like Denver, Minneapolis, Philadelphia. Oakland most recently opened up 74 miles of what they're calling slow streets last weekend. I think there's still a lot of questions around how to do this in a just and equitable way. And frankly, this is, like Dennis was talking about, this isn't something that I think people expected to implement overnight. So it's somewhat of a work in progress. However, this is something that we should have been prepared to do. I think there's been a long desire to really open up public space to more of the movement of people. And there are a lot of principles that we can take. We do have organizations and people. There's a gentleman named Mike Lydon who runs Streets Plans. It's working on ways to quickly do tactical urbanism to create essentially open spaces for people to recreate, to walk, to get around. However, I think, this still brings up the question of access. I think people are still considering open streets in a physically distancing point of view. I know in my neighborhood, I live in Washington, D.C., and the city has not decided yet to close streets to cars. It doesn't actually address, I think, real accessibility needs. The bus stops in my neighborhood are still packed. So we need to look at ways kind of beyond open streets to continue to create that access, both through transit, through micromobility. We've seen some companies step up their scooters and offer them to essential workers. We've seen other companies who are really interested in profit take those off the streets right away because they figured they weren't going to make a profit with them anymore. So thinking about mobility needs, But, I think overall there is an opportunity to start to reclaim some of the space. We have to be really mindful about the implications, the design of it, where you're going to have those. It is critical to get people, out there moving, creating more access to jobs. It's actually a safety issue. There's been an increase in speeding now that there's less cars on the road. We're actually seeing higher rates of speeding in most cities, and speeding is the number one determining factor in whether a traffic crash is fatal. So we actually have a safety imperative to deal with this. And I'm hoping that we can look at these cities, look at these examples as models that can not just be short-term, but long-term solutions. If you're specifically interested in where this is happening, at the National Complete Streets Coalition, we're actually crowdsourcing a map that's visualizing all these actions. So you can go to smartgrowthamerica.org, send us what you have. We're also doing a webinar in 2 weeks, but we're seeing, what's interesting is we're seeing these solutions, solutions that often we were told would take, decades to implement, happen overnight in response to this.
One quick thing I'll add to what Emiko was just saying. In my neighborhood, people are already walking in the middle of the street. Pretty much whenever I go out of the house, I see that. And I think at the same time, like Emiko was just saying, when there aren't as many cars around, but when they do come through, they're coming fast. And so there's a real safety issue with how people are already managing to get around their neighborhoods. And so I think the cities need to recognize that they need to be responding to the way that people's behavior is already changing, and kind of catch up to the way that individuals and communities are responding quickly to kind of the changing conditions. And I think to the point someone mentioned about sort of tactical urbanism strategies earlier, I think that there's an opportunity to kind of empower communities to slow their own streets and do things that might be faster than what kind of the city is able to kind of do in a top-down way right now.
Thank you. In both of those responses, safety and health were related or talked about at the intersection of how that relates to transportation. So how are transportation and public health interlinked? And I will start with Rio.
I think what COVID-19 has really highlighted for us is I think what COVID-19 has highlighted for us is really this thought. I'm trying to kind of really frame it in this understanding that it's really highlighting the ways in which our social determinant of health, right, all the varieties, which includes housing, transportation, access to amenities, etc., have been really fractured in some communities, right? The virus itself is the virus. Again, and I know there's a lot of theories about where it came from, where it didn't come from, but the virus is doing what a virus does, right? It seeks to live. And the virus, though, is not classist, it's not racist, it's not any of those things. Yet what we are seeing right now is that it is coming, particularly in America, right? Like this is a global issue, right? So I think there's also something to be said about the analysis of a global, right? But at least particularly in America, what we are seeing is communities that are Black, African American, communities that are immigrant, communities that are indigenous, reservations, right, are getting hit disproportionately high. Like this is a serious highlight of the ways in which we have prioritized some people and literally, I would say, dehumanize other groups, right? And the reality is that all of us get impacted. And I think that I hope that COVID-19 as a teacher, right? Because one of my elders told me, let this be a teacher. This has to be a teacher. If we're not learning from this, we didn't do our job, right? And one of the things that I think is teaching me is that we literally are all interconnected. There's no doubt about it at this point. Like this is happening at a global scale. Everybody's hurting at a global scale, which means that actually all of us have to work at a global scale to take care of our communities who are getting hit the hardest. Like, what does it actually mean to provide reliable communities, right? And again, bringing it back to this transportation piece, and again, just wanting to really set the framework. What does it mean to build communities that are full, holistic, healthy, right? That's going to be something we're really going to have to tackle. And then an additional point to think about, and not that I want to highlight the positive, but it's incredible to see that our air is cleaning up, our rivers are cleaning up. Like, we are hearing reports from around the world that people have seen the cleanest air, the cleanest rivers, right? Animals returning back to inner city centers. Like, that's incredible. And it's the pause that it took us, particularly our car-centric globe and environment, right? Like, ultimately speaking, I think as transportation folks, we know that both freight and the movement of people has caused a devastating effect on our planet, right? And what we know about an unhealthy planet is when our planet is not healthy or well, viruses and bacteria thrive, right? And I think that's something that's even going to be a call to action for us as mobility justice advocates and transportation advocates, is how do we help ensure to take care of Earth at this time? Because Earth's health is our health. I think everybody could agree to this at this point, that we can see the interlink between that, because even the reason why some particular communities are getting hit hard by COVID-19, it's a respiratory disease, right? Our communities that have high rates of asthma. Well, why do they have high rates of asthma? Well, they're in an environmental justice zone, which means they might be having tons of freight, or maybe they're living next to a port, or maybe they're living next to a freeway, right? These all issues compromise people's respiratory systems, right? And why do we choose what communities are allowed to be exposed to that? No one should be allowed to be exposed to that, right? And I think this is the time to really change the health outcomes for our first and frontline, our most disenfranchised communities, right? Which again, we are seeing Black, African-American communities, and then thereafter we're seeing Indigenous communities and immigrant communities, right? Like, the racial hierarchy is being seen really clearly right now. And it is time definitely for us to take action in ensuring health. And we as mobility justice advocates and transportation advocates do have a huge piece of that. And one thing I will leave as a resource for people is, if you have not watched Unnatural Causes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick? Very important piece for everybody to watch. I mean, the title says it, Unnatural Causes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick? It's a PBS documentary that I just been telling people to go check it out. It's a 4-hour documentary, but very important on public health, and definitely makes the connections to the transportation realm as well.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that this is unfortunately not surprising for any of us that work at the intersection of public health and the built environment, but this should be a huge wake-up call for those that don't, that we are absolutely seeing how health disparities, which we know are caused by the built environment, are disproportionately impacting populations. And to ground it in like a story that, in kind of my past experience, I used to work for King County, and I lived in Montlake, which I'm going to assume a lot of you on the call know, which is right by the University of Washington. And I worked in South King County near the airport, and this was the time that King County was really pioneering some of the work around your zip code determines your life outcomes. And we knew then, and we know this at a national and global scale, that your built environment actually determines your health outcomes. So hypertension, chronic disease, asthma, all the things that are making you most susceptible to becoming fatally impacted by COVID-19. So it was not a surprise at all last week when we started to see more and more reports of Black communities who are being the first, most kind of obvious, disproportionately represented in this. I'd say for all of us who work on this, and the really rallying call for us is, this is actually what we do. And this should be, the time for us to say, like, we have to, what Rio says, without these holistic communities that really have good transportation systems, healthy air, mixed use, access to food, access to education, access to jobs. The other link that I see around public health and transportation that's kind of fits into all of these health disparities is that most Americans don't, many Americans who don't have cars don't have reliable access to transportation. In a pre-COVID-19, I think it was 3.6 million Americans couldn't access medical care, like non-urgent medical care, because they didn't have reliable transportation. And that was disproportionately communities of color, women, immigrants, older adults, and rural communities. That's not changing. And in the short term, I think we need to be thinking, how are the kind of those without cars or access to a vehicle who are, often low income, again, immigrant communities of color, rural communities, older adults, accessing the care they need right now in COVID-19. I was part of a discussion earlier today with actually Real, where we're talking about the fact that to get tested in many states, you need to be in a car. How would you get to the hospital if you didn't have a car right now? And you needed to receive care. Are you supposed to get in a lift and endanger someone else? Are you supposed to get on transit? So we need to be thinking about, really, we haven't built in those transportation choices that provide people, that have ever provided people access to care. But we're seeing that really exacerbated right now.
So what would we say to folks that are highlighting right now? There's some questions about that are really rooted in the idea that people have choice about where they can live. But this sort of larger narrative that the cause of the pandemic is density and proximity to other people, and that the solution to that is going to be, or a response to that is that people are going to choose and move to less dense areas. Will COVID-19 create the conditions under which what we see is increased suburbanization and sprawl-based land use and development? Will it be sort of a wealth flight from the cities? Alex, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, to the point that Ria was making a little earlier about this being a teaching moment, I think it's important that we take the right lessons from this pandemic. I do think that there is an initial reaction of, proximity is a danger in terms of exposure, and so there's an association with density, with New York City being so prominently in the news lately. I think there's also an association with New York being sort of the densest place in the country. But I think, if you look around the world to places that are handling the pandemic well, it's often in some of the most densely populated cities in the world, right? You think about South Korea and Seoul, you think about Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Taipei. So clearly, it's not, there's not really a direct causation there. And I also think, when we talk about a lot of the issues that we've just been talking about in terms of, you're having a healthy community where you're not disproportionately impacted by sort of environmental justice and negative health issues, living in a community that has sort of the infrastructure and the types of local services where you can walk to get services you need, get to healthcare that you need. Those types of places are actually going to need to be denser in order to support having services locally. They're the kind of neighborhoods that ultimately are going to be really dependent on having good transit service, because you just can't fit people in and out of those places all in cars. So I think we're in the early stages of this, and I think that the benefits of some of those resilient systems are going to become more apparent over time. And I think that we're actually going to see just sort of a further demand for those types of places. And I think that's just going to exacerbate sort of the inequality of access that we've seen over the last decade and for longer in some places, to those kinds of neighborhoods where you have sort of those healthier living conditions and also access to those kinds of local services. The other thing I think that I hope this is a teaching moment for is that we need places that are resilient, not just for a virus, but that are also going to be resilient in the face of other types of crises. And so I think, again, thinking about those kinds of local overlapping systems is going to be really important. Thinking about climate change and not only sort of the kind of direct connections to climate change that we're seeing and sort of the current changes in behavior, but I think the coronavirus is a great teacher in terms of the importance of acting early to stop impacts later. And we've been seeing the way that if you do something that feels like overreacting now, you're going to be in the position that you need to be in later to be okay. And if you do what seems sort of like the adequate response now, it's not going to be enough. And I think the climate change is a really similar dynamic. It's just that the timeline and the time lag is just drawn out a lot more. And I hope that that's something that we learn from this. And and one of the most important ways that we can take action now to address climate change challenges in the future is to move towards communities where walking, biking, and transit are more accessible, and we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So I think those for me are kind of three other things to be thinking about as we make decisions about sort of what types of communities we're building in the future. And the other thing I think is, there's a myth that this is all about individual choice. And, but really the decisions that the US has made over the last 80 years to become a much more low density suburban country relative to the rest of the world is a lot about policy. It's not so much about individual choice.
So sort of looking into the near-term response, shortly the federal government will continue to roll out several recovery packages in the coming months, as well as states will be doing the same. Every level of government will be oriented around responding to this crisis. What recommendations do you have for both the immediate crisis response as well as long-term economic recovery? And what are you going to be advocating for? I'm going to start with Dennis.
Well, I think I'll start with the last question first. What are we advocating for? What we at the Amalgamated Transit Union would be advocating for is personal protection equipment. Additional monies going to the transit agencies because they need the monies to supply the personal protection equipment, but also to protect their employees. If you looked at the stimulus package, part of the monies that went to the airline industry it was to be used to maintain their employees. So their employees will be paid throughout this whole pandemic. We feel that in transit, we need that too. We're essential. And, if I get sick or there's a fear that I could spread it, we should be able to go off work until we are clear to come back to work. And there should not be a loss of wage involved in that. So that's two of the things that we would be advocating for going forward. And that would be in the long term. For the short term, once again, I just can't get away from the personal protection equipment. That is probably the most important issue that we have before us right now. If our folks keep on getting sick, on being exposed, then the employer is going to be forced to reduce service because there won't be enough employees there to provide the service, which then would reduce it, and the general public, those that need to go to the grocery store, doctor's appointments, get to work, whatever the case may be, there will be less bus service going in that direction. So it all comes down, in my mind anyway, is all for the personal protection services. We need to increase that to a much greater degree. I think going forward, hopefully this will never happen again in our lifetimes, but in the event that it does, there is a plan in place by the agencies, and the unions will be made aware of it, and they will have stockpiled enough personal protection equipment to deal with the issue if it ever does raise its ugly head again.
I just wanted to mention, so what I'll be advocating for in the short term and the long term. In the long term, Smart Growth America actually released our stimulus recommendations last week, so I encourage everyone to look at them. But one of the things that we'll be looking for specifically from the Smart Growth angle is that any dollars that say go into an infrastructure package are actually about and that could be transportation, but it also could be housing, land use, are actually about building, getting the money into the communities, building things like complete streets, which we actually know have a higher return. They create more jobs. They have more benefits that we don't see. This just going to highway dollars, highway construction, and large infrastructure projects where really the money goes straight to construction companies, and we don't actually get to see that. But in the short term, I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about is, one, absolutely, Dennis, we need to be getting money to the transit agencies right now. Transit agencies, we need to be overall looking at how we fund transit in the United States. We put a huge burden, I think, we put a huger burden on transit agencies than we do, say, the airline or the freight or private industry, and yet they provide an essential service. But another thing that I've really lost a lot of sleep over that we're working for in Washington, D.C., but I want everyone to be thinking about as you contact your elected officials is how are our groups, how are really nonprofit advocacy groups and those who are continuing, our place-based groups, groups focused on equity, how are they going to weather this pandemic? Because they're often the ones in a economic structure where we can't always rely on government or the administration to take care of people. We need our advocacy groups. We need our community-based groups. And I truly have been worried about whether whether all of them throughout the country will be able to survive this financially. And so how are we getting money, not just to large companies, but to our small nonprofits? How are we making sure that our community-based organizations stay alive? And that's one of the things that I think is really relevant in transportation, but I'd like to see more conversation about.
I would like to add that Rio's comment about the disadvantage and how they are not able to access transit is accurate. And it's based on ridership, unfortunately. So there's a lot of restrictions on transit in my mind that are unfunded mandates by the federal government. I believe that if the federal government wants transit agencies to do something, they should be paying for that. The monies that the transit agencies receive for operations is not so much for the larger agencies. They have to rely on local sources of revenue. But the smaller agencies, some of them are small enough that they use federal monies for operations, but I don't think it's enough. If you look at some of these agencies, they're having difficulty providing the service without the monies. They operate in rural areas. Sales tax, for instance, is not a high amount of money that they're getting to support it. The federal government should remove some of these unfunded mandates and start funding them again like they used to years ago. So, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I can chime in there a little bit because what I am really upset that the United States of America, which definitely has the wealth to solve so much of the pandemic issues, right, particularly in the communities that need it the most, right, and our frontline workers, is not choosing to do so, right? There's to me, there's no reason why we're doing any corporate bailouts for non-essential, organizations or firms, etc. That doesn't even make sense. The people, we need to center the people first, right? And I think that that's what we're doing. And it's very classic United States to be focusing on the economy versus focusing on the people, right? Like, what does it look like when we're not saying, hey, let's stimulate the economy, but what does it look like when we're instead saying, let's stimulate our people's health so that we can be a better nation, right? Like, what does that mean, right? We're going about this backwards. Like, the economic plundering that it's done on the earth is what put us in this problem in the first hand, right? This is a result of globalization, without a doubt, without a doubt. And Earth is trying to heal at this time, right? Like, the reason why people are deathly sick is because we've harmed Earth, which means we have bad air to breathe. We have bad water. Even within the United States, we're hearing people are not even having access to clean water. Even within California, which produces a lot of the nation's wealth, not everybody does. Like, we have a lot of farm workers right now who don't even have access to clean water. Like, it's a struggle for them to get it, right? And so those are some of these really deep-rooted institutional forms of like racism, classism, etc., that are still here, and they could be solved. The money is there. There's no reason why the money is not being used to really load up our grocery workers, our transportation workers. Like, they should be getting all the funding right now to first and center, right? Everybody needing that. So I'm thinking about that a lot. And then the last thing I will say, I think as you were speaking, Dennis, I was thinking, like, geez, like, the people who ride the bus that usually keeps up any bus or transit system are usually folks that are low-income, blue-collar workers across the nation, without hands down. These very people are the ones who technically have the lowest amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, right? And yet it's these very people who are being impacted by high rates of asthma and other social determinants of health that is really causing them to be at the peril of COVID-19. That is something profound. We should be rewarding people who take transit, actually. We should be rewarding them. We should be applauding people who take active transportation choices, right? And that's something that I think we do have the chance right now to fix, right? And it's a matter of our politicians choosing people over the economy, choosing people over the corporations, and ultimately choosing the planet, because the planet takes care of all of us. We all rely on this planet. This is our Earth. We need to love our planet because the Earth will love us, right? And I think that's where we're going to have a transformation and a giant shift. We have to change.
It's easy when kind of seeing the big gap between the needs that our communities have and what the government is currently, the response that we've seen so far, to feel kind of demoralized. But I think that it's really important for us to not lower our expectations in response, and to think and to keep our eye on, what is the world that we want, and to the points that are made before, we have the resources to do what we need to do. It's really about just building the political will and the power to make that happen. And I think, part of that to me is in supporting frontline workers, not only supporting them in terms of getting them the financial resources and systems that they need, but supporting them in claiming their power, because part of what being frontline means is that we need them. And I think that this is a moment when we can radically rethink who has power in this country. And I think supporting frontline workers is a big part of being able to do
that. In terms of seizing on this learning opportunity to create change that is needed to have a healthier planet and people, how can cities, transit agencies, transportation advocates, and communities prepare right now to meet the immediate challenges and the long-term opportunities that are presented by this moment in terms of a just economic recovery? And how can organizing and engagement be equitable in a time of physical distancing, disparities of access to technology, and the digital divide? So I will start with Rio.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I think just to highlight the digital divide right now, right? That I talked about this on a conversation about 4 weeks ago when I said, hey, about maybe 6 weeks ago, we were all experts at community engagement. And now it's a whole new ballgame because the people we would go access, which was sometimes youth at schools or, mothers at schools too, right? Or the grocery stores or wherever people are organizing, we're not able to have that access anymore like we used to, right? And I think there's something to be said about one, just solving that digital divide, right? I won't spend too much time on it, but I do think it requires us to go back to some classic organizing, right? Which includes, what is our local radio station? What are our local newspapers, right? Because people are still reading that, and literally phone trees, right? How do we use that phone tree mechanism to make sure that folks who are able to access these interfaces can make sure to spread the message within their family and then further out, right? I think we have to go back to some of those classic forms of organizing and communication, right? We have the tools, we've done it before. It's possible to go back to it again. And the second piece on thinking about what cities, agencies, governments need to be doing, for me, and I want to make sure that this is foundational now moving forward to my work, is that the government's going to need to humble themselves to listen to what indigenous people, what frontline workers, I think Alex, you said it well, like that's the power. Our essential workers are the power. They're what holds up all of us. Like I'm still getting groceries because somebody's risking their lives from the field to the freight to the grocery. Like they should have power, right? And there's also, and this is why I really give a round of applause to TCC to really making that land acknowledgement in that really beautiful way, because there's a lot to be said about indigenous communities here, but even across the globe, who've been putting Earth first and people first. Their governments as well, right? Their nations, they have protocols, they have ways of being that I think if government could just humble themselves to listen, we can get a lot of direction, right? And of course, to me, it's like, listen, resource, compensate, right? Value as an expert of the very lands we're in. And some things we're even seeing is that in this global pandemic, it's outrageous that I'm still getting things from like food from Chile or China or Brazil. Like we used to be able to survive super locally, right? That reduces so much of our freight by default, right? What does it mean to eat what's already available in the lands we're in, right? To grow what is possible to grow without putting more pressure on the earth, right? And I think we're going to have to start looking at them. And this is why I've started to move to that intersection of land, earth, and mobility justice, is because at this point, without a doubt, all departments across government need to start working together, right? We have seen so many times that government agencies work in silos. That's ridiculous. And the same thing for us as movement organizers. We're going to need to start working together collaboratively to build those full communities, right, that I've talked about. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, we're really going to have to pay attention. I'm very traditional in this way, but we're really going to have to start listening to some of our elders who've lived through the HIV pandemic, right, who've lived through or heard stories of some of the other diseases, right, or other catastrophes, right? We're going to have to start listening to see what knowledges that they have so they can inform us going forward.
I would like to add that this is a very good opportunity for organizing, be it community organizing, union organizing. If we don't take advantage of this and show people what we did for them during this pandemic, and if we remain silent, then we are probably going to repeat the same mistakes. And what's that saying that to repeat the same mistakes and expect a different outcome is insanity? Well, we have to change. And if we don't start doing it and we don't start the movement, then we are going to just fall back into the same old way of doing business. And the people of the United States, whether they're union or not. We need to reach out to them and show them what we've done to protect our groups of people that we represent, so that they will come along and demand the changes that Leo is talking about.
I think to add to that, I think Rio and Dennis made really great points. I think as a former county employee, one of the things, because Alex, you asked what should cities be doing right now? I think one of the things, and Rio brought up some great ways to do organizing right now, while people are staying at home. It is, and this should be true during all engagement, but really when we're in a time of kind of collective crisis, is to be willing to ask people what they need, not necessarily go with our solutions. Like, I tend to think of everything is in terms of transportation and a transportation solution. And for many people, that could be a real concern. How am I going to get to work now that they've cut bus service? You know, what is, you know, now that there's more speeding, you know, my walk no longer feels as safe, but also to recognize that people are struggling with like really basic economic, housing, and food security needs, and be prepared to listen to that, and to figure out how we can put our resources behind kind of what people's immediate needs are. And I say that as someone that always comes forward with first a built environment solution, but that really, I think this is ever a teaching time, that we always need to be able to listen and figure out how we can get people what they need before we talk about kind of longer term or shorter term transportation solutions.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to questions from the folks who are participants. So a question is, what does equity and equitable service delivery in transit actually look like? Can you give us some examples? And with such a bleak funding future, and people very worried about health and safety, riding and operating transit, what are the opportunities and rays of hope for preserving and expanding transit service in the near future? Is transit doomed?
I don't believe transit is doomed. I just believe that there should be more federal assistance for the operating, instead of buildings and capital improvements, which is needed, don't get me wrong. Park and rides in the outlying areas is a prime example of people driving to a local central spot and then taking a transit vehicle the rest of the way. But funding is the big issue. And the way I've looked at it over the years is, you know, people do not have cars, but they pay for the roads that the cars drive on. So the argument that I don't use transit, so therefore I shouldn't have to pay for it, in my mind, falls on deaf ears. Everybody should pay for it, just like everybody pays for roads. Not everybody needs the fire department or the police department in their entire life, yet they pay for it. Why is transit? Transit is a public service along with fire, police, and roads, and probably medical as well, since they seem to be a little bit of frontline employees now. So I think there needs to be more federal investment and state investments, all the way down the chain, from federal down to local. There needs to be more investments, and not I hesitate to say cater to a certain class of people, but because of the restrictions on the funding, you know, in some locations, people have to walk a quarter of a mile or more to get to a main bus line. When years ago, when I started, that was not the case. If you had to walk 2 blocks to a bus, you know, that was a long walk back then. And it all centers around the funding. So that's what I have.
Thank you. I totally agree. Here in Washington State, the anticipated cost to our transit agencies is profound, which is cost on top of what was already deep need. So it is critical that we have people in positions of power who are making decisions about how we allocate our resources that emphasize public transit. To the panelists, what ideas do you have for transitioning from sprawl to walkable transit-based communities, especially in this climate? Alex, I think this might be a good one for you to start with.
Sure. I feel like there's so many answers to that question. I'm not totally sure where to start. At a really local level here in Seattle, the city of Seattle is starting their comprehensive plan update this year. And that's a really important document that's going to shape how the city grows over the next 2 decades. And I think that there's a really great opportunity right now to make sure that alternatives that are being considered, so the comp plan will come up with a set of alternatives that will go through an environmental impact statement this year. And it's really important that within those alternatives, we see options for increasing those types of, I would say, not just transit-oriented communities, but also those sort of holistic communities that have the local businesses and services that have public spaces where when we're able to use public space again, we can gather, that have that encourage the kinds of community building and sort of social resilience that we need. And I think that Seattle's just one example of cities across Washington state that are going to be entering that type of planning right now. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. That's just one lever to kind of push on to do that. And one other thing that I'll mention, and this is kind of a bigger pie in the sky thing, but we're going to need, in terms of housing. Housing is a big part of building those communities, and we're going to need in the short term to figure out how do we prevent evictions and foreclosures and people losing their homes. But I think at the same time, we need to be thinking long term about how do we build the types of affordable and accessible housing that we want in the future in the communities that we want to have. And after World War II, for example, we made this huge investment in providing greater access to housing for a lot of people, but it had some big drawbacks. One, there was racial bias and restrictions built into those programs, right? So that people of color couldn't get the same kinds of mortgages that white folks could get, and there was also a really strong suburban bias built into those systems. And I think that if we can rethink a similar scale of housing investment, but one that focuses on equity and bringing housing access to the folks who've been denied it in the past, and that also focuses on building the types of urban communities that we want, I think that's a huge opportunity to get to the future that we want.
That was huge, Alex, that what you mentioned. And I think that's super important to underscore, right? That when we do a lot of these public benefits, at least here in the United States, like often it is a certain group. We're seeing that even in the stimulus recovery, right? Like if you know how to access the EIDL or the PPP loan, even if you don't know, like that's already by default, like you don't have access to that information. Like if you don't know how to access that, which is meant for small businesses, right? Like it's the first time in the United States where they're doing a stimulus package that encourages independent contractors. But the reality is, and what's very point blank to me clear is like, I'm pretty sure people who are like gardeners are not getting that same information, right? And so there is this continuous divide where it's like, hey, public benefits for all, except if we're not giving the information or access, right, proactively in that equitable rate, right, which is not equal. That's $1,200 check that a lot of us are getting is an equal act, kind of ish. It's not actually equitable, right? We're going to continue to perpetuate the same type of systems we've had. And I think Dennis said it well, like if we're not learning from history, we're going to keep repeating it. And this is not the first time we've had this. There's so many times in the United States history that we can see this, right? And what often happens in these really great, these terrible times of peril, like the Great Depression, etc., is that wealth gets conglomerated. That's an important point. Wealth gets conglomerated into, again, a certain section of the population, and the income gap divide gets bigger. It has not shrunk. It has actually gotten bigger, right? And then we're dealing with the fact that a lot of what used to be public entities are getting privatized, right? And so now you are definitely unevening out the field in a complete way, right? Because now it's only, oh, I have money to pay for good food. I have money to pay for good housing, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said about that example with the mortgages that was given, and to whom, right? And to what extent was it moving, right? And again, the emphasis around that, yes, it helped out some people, but the emphasis was really on corporations, right? And banks. Like the emphasis was that actually ultimately who won was banks and corporations, right? It wasn't even a people as a mass, right? Like most of rural middle America, which happens to be predominantly white and poor, didn't necessarily see all those benefits either, right? And so it is a time to really start flipping around what community means, right? Like what does it mean to build out communities? And it's definitely should not be government led. Like I will say that right now, they have not done a good job about it. They've done a terrible job about it. But there is some powerful, I know there's some powerful advocate politicians within it, right? There's some, and then I think we're gonna have to back them, but also demand for a change in the system, because we're all losing out on it, right? One unhealthy community somewhere, we all lose out on it. We all grieve that, right? Those are we're connected, right? And so I think that united, we're gonna have to make that front that actually somebody dying because of poverty, because of race, actually hurts us all, period, right? There's nobody that can escape that hurt, right? And that's the reasons why I think we're dealing with high levels of stress, right? High levels of mental health issues, is that we're actually not resolving some of the real big pains that we have in this country, right? Or even at a global, we're not resolving it. So a lot of it's getting internalized, right? And that's the second point I wanted to make about neighborhoods, is that one thing we know for a fact is that we need to create neighborhoods that stimulate people's immunity, literally, right? What does that look like to make sure that people's immunities are healthy and holistic? And that does mean reducing stressors. That does mean removing like environmental health issues, right? And some part of the stressors are just access to transportation, access to these resources. And I know I've said it again, but I want to say it from another perspective of like, what does it mean to protect us by building strong people, healthy people, right? Because if anybody's weak, then we're seeing it now. We all are subject to it, which is why all of us are in shelter in place, right? Because we have created an environment in which some people's immunities are just shot, right? We need to create an environment where we have strong, healthy people across, and definitely we have the funding for it, right? We have the knowledge for it. We have the data for it. We have the medical profession for it. So there is no excuse. And I think that's going to be part of our work, is to really demand it. And Dennis said it well, people got to unionize. Really, all those folks who are at the front line, now this is the time to be like, you guys are very important. Like, stand up, say it. Like, let's not let anybody be exploited during these times.
Across, we've been talking about how transit is being highlighted, about how essential it is now and how essential it has always been. We hear a lot in the public dialogue around free school and education, advocates around free healthcare, and the conversation around free public transit has remained peripheral. Is now the time to reevaluate whether or not transit should be provided as a free basic service to people?
Well, what I'm hearing is that a lot of the homeless people are now riding the buses and with no destination. So they ride to the end of the line, they ride back, and they stay on the bus all day or all night or whatever the case may be. So I think in a situation like that, I don't think anybody really envisioned that to happen. We're experiencing it in a lot of locations now where folks need to have a destination. I understand that King County Metro have put professionals on the buses to help these homeless folks get to a home, a location that they could take care of, because the homeless population, they don't get to watch the news or read the newspaper. They may not even know what's going on. They may be carriers and they don't know. So although free bus fare now is the way to go, I think there needs to be some regulation on the use of free buses. But once again, I think the agencies get somewhere around 18 to 20% of their revenue from fares. So that needs to be made up somehow. They can't take another hit like that. That's a big hit and funding source. So if we could find a way where they can make up the loss, then I think free transit is the way to go.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of notes to that. One, I think we should absolutely be looking at a free transit system. We subsidize, there is no excuse that Congress can't come up with funding to make good, reliable, high quality transit affordable or free in this country. We subsidize many other industries, including the building of highways, agriculture, private industry, more than we ever do transit, and the impact it could have not just on equity, but on actually our economy and our access and our health would be huge. There is, when there is a will in Congress, there is a way. And I think there are ways to look at how we've been designating billions and billions of dollars every year into the construction of highways, and looking at how that could be spent on transit. To Dennis's point about who the use of transit, I think, and you mentioned for the unsheltered homeless, I think that gets to a larger systematic issue of people having a sense of belonging, and that all these solutions have to be done holistically. We have a giant housing crisis in the United States. And so, the fact that people choose or need to ride transit all day is really a symptom of a much larger and equitable system. And so, I think that's one of the things you have to tackle holistically, but there is no reason we can't take, we subsidize highways and driving immensely. Driving has not paid for itself in 20 years. We have not risen the gas tax or adjusted for inflation in over 20 years. We're subsidizing transportation. We're subsidizing the things we think we want to be subsidizing. So I think there are ways to do it. There are mechanisms. It could be free for all. It could be free for those in need, but it's definitely a point to start to, I think we should explore it more and have larger conversations about it.
I agree. Thank you.
We're all agreeing that more resources for transit and healthy transportation is absolutely critical. So a lot of the people on this panel and a lot of people on this call are passionate transportation advocates and urbanists. How can we amplify the messages being discussed here, how essential transit is, what transit workers have provided, sort of that respect, acknowledgement, and dignity that Dennis mentioned? How can the story of this be highlighted in public more than it is now? And how can we get the message around transportation need and opportunity more into the mainstream dialogue?
Yeah, one of the ways that I see this playing out is that right now we're seeing the impacts most immediately in our urban areas in regards to COVID-19, but I think we'll soon start to see how they're devastating rural America. I mentioned the number earlier that 3.6 million Americans can't get reliable access to healthcare right now before COVID-19. That's disproportionately higher in rural areas. And it's rural communities that most rely on volunteer transit service just to get people around. So I think this is really the opportunity to speak to our rural communities, regardless of where they are in the United States, about having more sustainable transportation options, but also housing options. Often people are living in isolated rural areas because they cannot afford even to move towards closer to their city center in their community. Um, and so to look at that, I also think that really, when we've talked about this at Smart Growth America for years, that transportation is also the number one barrier, not just to reliable, not just to healthcare, but to get to work. And I think any of us who have filled out, a job form in the last decade or so, one of the questions you ask is, do you have reliable transportation? And there's an interest, whatever party you are at, into having a reliable workforce. And if you can't get people to work on time because they don't own a car, I think that is a message that we have found resonates across the country, across political affiliations, is that the ability to reliably and safely get to work and to get to education, to get to healthcare, to get to food is something that makes sense to people. It makes economic sense if you, whether we're participating in our current capitalist economy or a different one, being able to reliably access work, healthcare, education, and food is something I think most Americans identify with.
Yeah, and I'll add to that point, Emiko. I think, again, it's one of the things that I think is so powerful about the work is that literally we are at the intersections of accessing every single resource out there, right? That's what we're advocating for, right? And for people to navigate it safely and securely, right? Ultimately. And yeah, and one of the things that when you were speaking, I thought about was just like, yeah, it is really ridiculous that you have to have a car in a lot of cases to work anywhere, right? Like that's really hard. But on top of that, it again creates that survival divide, right? Like the survivalist divide, that if you have a car, which means you have already money, you can get more money, right? Because the other pieces of the data is that actually people who have cars make a lot more money than people that do not have cars, right? And that is something really interesting to think about, like not in this transportation realm. And at this time, I think also what's been highlighted is the ways in which how car-centric we have built our global economy, right? Really car-centric, right? Really individualistic, right? And I definitely think that transit needs to be highlighted above all, because it is getting to some of the people who just cannot have a car for a myriad of reasons, right? Some of them for economic reasons, but some of them really related to disability issues, right? So there's a lot of work around with disability justice people being like, they need transportation, period. Like, right? Because they can't XYZ drive a car for whatever reasons, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said about that. And even as we were speaking and I was reading the question, I thought, like, yeah, transit workers do need to be highlighted, right? How do we even ever compensate for the fact that they are risking their lives? That some of them have already lost their lives. Like, we heard of somebody here who was in Echo Park, who was a bus driver, who lost a bus operator who lost his life also to COVID-19, right? And we're hearing this across the nation. Like, that is something we're going to have to contend with as organizations, as people who care about people, is how do we ever compensate for the risk that transit workers along the line with the other frontline workers are taking right now, not only for themselves, but also for the families they live with, right? And that, I will say that it has a lot of terrible wages for a lot of those workers, right? The wage is outrageously low, right? And so that's going to have to be something deep in that they need to be severely compensated for that risk. And that's the bare minimum, right? Like, the reality is they shouldn't be risking their lives at this rate, right? With that immense exposure, as Dennis talked about. Like, that's ludicrous that we're allowing for that to happen.
There's one thing I've noticed, and I have cars, but We cannot build our way out of congestion, yet we spend how many millions and millions and millions of dollars on expanding the freeways and doing the road work. Instead, if that money was spent on transit, we probably would not have the congestions on the roads that we experience today. So yet we do, as a nation, we cater to the car owner. And we've experienced it in this state with numerous tax initiatives to reduce the cost of owning a car. We should be putting more money towards transit, coming up with rules and regulations to, well, maybe not rules and regulations, but have people ride transit more and drive less to work. There's a drive in and there's a drive out. If you're on the bus, you could take a HOV lane and probably get there faster than if you're a single occupancy car on a freeway. Or take light rail. It's expanding tremendously in the Puget Sound area. It's just that as a nation, we are spoiled. We're in the cars. No matter where we would go jump in the car rather than take the bus that might stop right outside your front door.
In our last closing minutes here, I have a question I'd love to hear from everybody, which is, so if we're in general agreement around the problems and the solutions here, where do we go in the short term? What does success look like just in the next few months, knowing that some of these problems, land use in particular, take a really long time? So what can we do in the immediate short term?
Go ahead, Alex.
Okay, I'll throw out a couple of things, and I think some of these are things we've talked about already. I think that there's shaping the relief packages that are going to come at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. The federal government is going to be the most important player here, but our state and local governments too. I think that's going to be so important. So, contacting your local representatives and senators to make sure that they hear about your priorities and how that funding should be spent, what it should be investing in, I think is really important in the short term. I think, also going back to some of that conversation about the sort of the safe streets and being able to get around your neighborhood without coming into close contact with other people. Those are things, as Emiko was saying, we can do really quickly. We can make so much more space for pedestrians on our streets than we currently do, and we can do it fast. And so, and I think that those are two really important pieces of the puzzle. And then I think, going back to, been talking about frontline workers and essential workers a lot. And I think there are going to be times when those workers need to demand better conditions for their work, right? And demand hazard pay and things like that. And it's going to be really important that community members are there to support them in those demands. And I think that's going to be a really important part of kind of building power long term to be able to make the kinds of changes that we want to see.
Yeah, I'll just echo that, Alex, what you mentioned. And I really believe that in the short term, we literally need to flood all of our frontline workers, right? All of the essential workers with the resources, right? Which includes money, compensation for hazard, and also all the equipment that Dennis talked about earlier, masks, clothes, showers, sanitation, like that shouldn't wait at all. Like that should have been there yesterday, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about those short-term solutions for the frontline workers. And then right alongside it, folks who are having food security and housing security issues right now, like that is some serious stuff. Like people are being evicted, people are losing homes, people have lost jobs. I know friends of mine who are waiting 2 hours to get a box of food in a compacted line. Like, how is that social distancing? The U.S. should be taking care of those people. Like, how do we make sure food is getting to people? right? The food is there. I talked about earlier how there's 10 million pounds of food being wasted right now because there's not enough restaurants getting it. Why is that not getting to our people? Why is the government not flooding freight and agriculturists to get that food and start passing it out where it needs? Like, clearly people need food, right? That's an essential service. So I think there's something to be said about that. And another thing that I'll add and close my thoughts here is that long-term success is going to be that we have had a transformative change in government, right? That it actually represents people and the planet, right? Like that it actually is doing that, and it's not so connected to corporations, right? Because it is right now. I don't think any of us can deny that, especially because I'm still unsure why corporations can access taxpayer money. Like that still doesn't make sense to me, right? When transit is having a hard enough time getting its fair cut and it's barely getting compensated, right? Like Dennis mentioned, like there's a lot more besides just the daily operations that needs to be had so that they can really move safely and healthily along the way, right? So I hope that we are moving towards a transformative community.
I'll just add a really quick thing because I think Alex and then Rio said a lot of the things I was thinking of. So just from my vantage point, it's obviously engaging in local, state, federal elected officials. But what I'm going to be doing in the short term is making sure that people can vote, that we have, that we're working, because I think who we have in office, this would be a very different conversation today if we had a different administration. I know all of you in Washington are able to vote by mail, but that is not the case. And frankly, I think one of the biggest things that I'll be focusing on in my personal time is making sure that if we are still under quarantine or go back come November and there'll be primaries coming up, that people can safely vote. I think that's a huge part of how things will play out. Because we do live in a democracy and there are elected officials, a representative democracy, who'll be making that. And we need to make sure that that we have people in office that are going to represent really the needs of the people and planet, as Rio would say. And I'm very concerned about voter suppression. So vote, and getting people to vote, helping people vote.
Well, I agree. I think this pandemic has come around at a time where we're going to have elections, and we need to change those folks that do not want to cooperate and rule, and I shouldn't say rule, govern the United States or the state or local level. We need to stop this fighting that's going on. We have a very dysfunctional Congress right now. We need to get people in there that are concerned in governing the United States and are willing to make deals with each other to accomplish that end. And I don't believe that that's happening right now. And now is the time for people to go out to the polls and vote for the candidates that are going to represent them and their interest. I'm going to get off my soapbox on that. We'll go on all day.
Please don't. But we are at the close of our time together. So I just want to express a huge amount of gratitude to the panelists and participants for sharing their time and their wisdom and experiences with us. TCC is going to be sending out a recording. So folks who are participants will receive that soon. You can stay in touch with TCC on all of our social media platforms, and we'll be connecting ways that you can stay in touch with the work that our panelists are doing here. And I'll just make a plug that both Transportation Choices Coalition and Futurewise are participating in Give Big, which is an annual giving for advocacy for nonprofit organizations. To the point that Emiko made earlier, advocacy organizations are important now more than ever. So we hope that you'll see our emails and respond to those. So thank you everyone for your time. And I look forward to continuing this work together.